The mood around that table must have been very strange. They had just watched their master wash their feet. They had heard him begin to talk about somebody going to betray him. And the mood did not improve as the Passover meal continued with its usual combination of questions and connections with the Passover, with the escape from Egypt, with the symbols of wine and bread and even an egg, which becomes a symbol for us this Sunday. So this Seder meal became something of an anxiety for the disciples. They began to look at one another and to ask each other with their eyes, what's he talking about? Who's going to betray him? And Peter nudges John, the beloved disciple, to say, ask him who it is. And John leans in and he says, Lord, who is it? Is it I? Is it the one with whom I dip my bread into this wine? He is the one who will betray me. Now this was actually a thing of great honor, for the piece of bread that was dipped into the wine to be given to one of the disciples elevated that disciple in the eyes of the other. So everybody around misunderstood when Jesus dipped the bread into the wine and gave it to Judas and whispered to him, whatever it is you're going to do, do it quickly. And you can almost imagine the shock in Judas's eyes when he realizes that Jesus knows. He knows what's going to happen, and maybe he begins to hope that maybe Jesus is using all of this to create the rebellion that Judas, the son of the knife, so urgently wants. Maybe he goes out now with a new heart to betray Jesus because he believes that the army of the people in the Mount of Olives, who are all lighting their fires even as this meal is ending, who are all preparing for a night outside the city because they cannot afford to live within it during this Passover meal. Maybe all these people will rise up and they will join in this great rebellion against the Roman conquerors. So he scurries off. And people, the disciples assume that there is actually an agreement that he's gone off to buy something or to get something. Now we're told that John Mark, who wrote the Gospel, may have been a young lad who was actually in and around this whole event in history. It is possible that it was his parents' house where this meal was being held. And in my mind, I like to think of Mark watching from a distance, maybe hidden, and actually watching all of this taking place, watching all of this happening, and then following them as they went, as they did each night, to a quiet place. They went to the Mount of Olives, this lovely, quiet, still place where you can actually rest, even with the fires and the fireside chats and the groups of people gathered together. There's different parts of the garden where you can go in, and it gets quieter and quieter. And he says to the 11 that are remaining, stay here a while. And then he calls James and John and Peter a bit further in, and they go a bit closer with him. But then he says to them, wait here, watch and pray. And so the whole experience has caught up with the disciples. Those who swore that they would go to Jerusalem and die with Jesus find themselves exhausted, emotionally and physically. They find themselves worn down and finding it impossible to stay awake, and they begin to drift off to sleep. Whereas Jesus is further in. He's further in on his own, and he's breaking his heart because he knows what's coming. And he's getting more and more anxious, as a human does when they know that their death is coming. And we're told that such is his anxiety that little beads of blood start to come onto his forehead. His blood vessels are breaking down in the sheer intense emotion and the sheer physical human feelings that Jesus is experiencing. And he cries out to God, Lord, if this is possible, Father, take this cup from me. He's asking God to protect him from this death, from this consuming of the sins of the world, of carrying the brokenness and the separation between humans and God. He's asking if it's possible, can this be taken away? And yet, even as he says it, it's almost like the last temptation of Lent. Because even as he says it, he says, but not my will, but yours be done. It's an incredibly courageous statement, because he knows the consequences. We can picture John Mark hiding among the olive trees. We can picture him taking all of this in as Jesus picks himself up off the ground and returns first to the 3 disciples who are asleep, and he shakes them awake and he says, could you not even wait with me 1 hour? Watch so that the devil doesn't consume you. You need to pray. You need to watch with me, and you need to pray. And he goes back and he prays again the same prayer, because he's still in this distress, this human fear that consumes him. And he comes, and then he says again, but not my will, but yours be done. And then he gets up and he goes back, and they've fallen asleep again. And he gets them up and he brings them back to the other 8. And they're all roused themselves, and he says, it is time. See, my betrayer comes to betray me with a kiss. And there comes Judas, ahead of the lighted torches, ahead of the temple guards, ahead of the people who have come to arrest him and to capture him. And they all spring up in alarm, because they realize what is going to happen. And Peter draws out his sword and he slices it across the face of one of the servants called Malchus, and he cuts his ear. And his voice rings out that as the whole situation develops into a dangerous, dangerous situation where lives are going to be lost, this voice carries right above it all that shouts out, enough! And it's Jesus. And suddenly, Judas and Peter and John and James and all the other disciples don't know what to do, because they thought they would fight. They thought this would begin something. And they're so scared they run away. And John Mark runs away as well, and he runs, but the guards try to seize him. And they grab onto his cloak, and they rip the cloak, and he runs away naked, a young lad who's just terrified of getting caught. And meanwhile, Jesus is left with those around him who despise him. He's left with those around him who hate him enough to want him dead. And as he heads off, he sees, whimpering and scampering away through the olive groves, Judas, the one who was so dear to him, the one who betrayed him with a kiss.